Hey everyone, this is Julia with episode number 81 of the Mixology Talk podcast. This week we're doing something a little bit different. I've invited our friend Greg Mays, one of the hosts of the Simple Cocktails podcast, to come and join me today for an interview. Hear how he got started, the story of his first book, and a drink I'm ashamed to admit to him that I drank in college. As usual, you can find the show notes over at mixologytalk.com/81. Let's get started. Very cool. So thank you so much for joining us, Greg. This is Greg Mays from the Simple Cocktails podcast. And I guess if you wouldn't mind just giving us a brief introduction, what's your story?
It's great to talk to you too. I sort of feel like this was bound to happen at some point because we also do a husband and wife podcast and it's about cocktails. And so it was bound to be that we ran into each other. So our story, let's see, really the story behind Simple Cocktails is about 5 or 6 years ago. I didn't know anything about cocktails, and we would go out and want to have drinks with our food and not know at all what to drink, and usually embarrass ourselves with our drink orders. We would like order stuff we saw in a movie or something.
Oh, I was right there with you. I didn't know anything before I started dating Chris, who was a bartender, and I definitely embarrassed myself.
Yeah, that's what happens. You don't know where to start. There isn't really like, okay, you're 21 now. Here's the training program for how to get good drinks. So I started writing about it. I got the domain name for Simple Cocktails. And the way I started is about once a month, I would go and be like, I've heard of Irish whiskey. I'm going to buy Irish whiskey. And I would buy it and make a couple of cocktails. And most of the time not enjoy the experience because I didn't really know what I was doing. Actually, I think the first liquor I bought was grappa, which is definitely not like the best place to start. Yeah.
That is an impressive start, though. That is like diving in the deep end.
Well, the guy at Trader Joe's told me not to. He was like, don't buy that. I don't think you're going to like it. And I was like, but the bottle looks so cool. I was really excited. So I did that for about a year, just kind of irregularly buying stuff, tasting it, not really knowing what to do. I started buying cocktail books. I'd usually just buy whatever was cheap, or I'd go to like thrift shops. And I bought a ton of Post-it notes and I would go through a book. So like my first one was 750 recipes. And I would go through it and I would put a Post-it on the pages that I had the stuff to make that recipe. And out of my 750 recipe book, I think I bookmarked like 3 cocktails.
That's a lot to read through though, too.
Yeah, exactly. And I was like, well, I guess I should get another book or something.
Or get some more ingredients for your bar. I'm not really sure.
Right, exactly. So then I started making a list. I had like a document on my computer that was a list of all these recipes so I wouldn't have to look through the whole book just to find them. And the list grew and I found some I really liked. And around this time I started kind of advising friends. They were like, oh, we want to buy some stuff. What do we buy? And I gave them advice and I started to build this like a buyer's guide. Like, oh, I got $50. What should I go buy if I want to make a bunch of drinks? And so I began to build all of that and started to get a little recognition from especially like liquor companies and stuff. And as you know, when you write and talk about booze, then the booze just starts coming to you at some point.
Indeed.
And so that helped me to kind of accelerate my writing and do it more often, which right now I usually do 2 liquor reviews or cocktail recipes a week and then 1 podcast episode. And so we started the podcast about 2 years ago. And yeah, basically do exactly on the podcast what I do at the blog. And that's we taste something and then we make something. We make a cocktail of something.
I love it though. I think that is the foundation of all of this, right? I mean, we can talk about the philosophy of cocktails, but at the end of the day, it's kind of about the thing that's in your glass and what it tastes like.
Yeah, that's exactly right. So that's kind of where we're at now and have had a lot of fun doing that, really.
Yeah, I think that it's so interesting to come at this industry from an outsider perspective. I definitely had sort of a similar experience in that I knew absolutely nothing about cocktails, spirits, anything like that before I started dating Chris. And I think we were married at least 2 years before I admitted what I was actually drinking in college because I wanted to make sure that he wasn't going to leave me. I was absolutely a rum and Coke drinker. There was a time, a really dark time in my life where we were just drinking straight Di Serrano.
Wow.
And I don't know why. I think it was just
Did you put it on
sweet.
ice, or did you just drink
We
it straight?
did put it on ice,
Okay, all right.
and it was kept in the freezer, which is really not much redemption. It was just awful.
Not at all. Yeah.
No, it was.
It sounds kind of classy for an outsider, but
And I think that's what we were going for. It's like, well, look, it's a fancy looking bottle, and it's so much better than the plastic bottles of vodka that our friends were drinking. So arguably, like, I don't think it really was much better, but. Yeah, I'm not sure. I've actually told Chris that. Maybe he won't listen to this and I'll be off the hook, but terrible.
That's pretty hilarious.
So I definitely know where you're coming from. And it's really intimidating, I think, to start in this world. It's just like, I think you forget what it's like to learn to cook. And how you're like, what do I do with garlic? And how do I know when to put salt in there and all of this? I think that's really, really challenging. And so I completely agree. So I like how you decided to just sort of start experimenting, though. Have you found that your experimentation has changed? Like, do you do things differently now that you're kind of deeper in this world?
I think the biggest difference is I don't waste as much liquor as I used to. I think I used to have an idea of what would make a good cocktail, or I would see a cocktail recipe in a book and not really know. And I'm sure you guys have the same experience. I can read a recipe and sort of have a general idea of how that will taste. You can look and say, oh, that looks like it's a little sweet, because it has a large percentage of simple syrup or whatever. And so I think that's the big one. So generally ahead of time, I kind of know if something's going to be good or if it's going to be sweet or what flavors play together. That's the biggest thing for me, is that I can sort of read all that ahead of time.
Well, you can probably do a better job of guessing which cocktails you're going to like.
Yeah, that's exactly right. Like, I can look at a menu, because when you look at a cocktail menu, you don't know what proportions they're using. So you go to a bar and it says, rye and fresh lemon, and you can read it and say, oh yeah, I like those ingredients. They would have to put them in very strange proportions to make that a bad drink.
And you can usually make kind of a guess, right? Well, I see, a spirit, a bitters, and a sweet. Okay, it's probably going to be something not terribly distant from sort of spirited cocktail ratio, like an old-fashioned or something like that.
Yeah, that's exactly right. And you start to know there's families of recipes. So you start to say, oh, the way this recipe is built is like this other kind of, usually it's the classics, right? Like there could be one classic like a Negroni, and there could be like 15 riffs on it. And so you kind of know what you're getting into.
So do you still, I have to ask because I'm just curious, do you still have that like $50 buyer's guide that you give to friends and family?
I do.
That's such a great idea.
Yeah, it's on the website. Now I'm going to have to remember where. I think if you go to About at the top and hover over it, I think it says Buyer's Guides. Maybe not. I haven't looked in a long time because
I'll see if I can find it so I can throw a link in the show notes. I think folks would like that.
Yeah, it's somewhere on there. We'll dig it up and I'll share it with you when I find it. Yeah, I think I did like a $50, $100, and a $250 buyer's guide.
That's great. Yeah, I think that we've definitely been asked that question quite a bit. I've got $100. I don't know anything. What do I do? and that's a hard question to answer. I mean, there's, because you could go so wrong if you don't know what you're doing. You could go to Trader Joe's and buy grappa, for example.
Yeah, exactly. In my list, yeah, that's totally true. My list is pretty mild, I would say. Like, whiskey people would probably be a little hurt by my list because my $50 list doesn't have any whiskey. It's like vodka, gin, triple sec, and then everything else, citrus and stuff like that. So but for me, that was the way I eased into this whole thing. And so I think other people can ease in that way as well.
Well, I think that's something, you just got to put a line in the sand as well. I know there's a book out there by David Solmonson and Leslie Jacobs Solmonson, I'm sure I'm saying their last name wrong, called The 12 Bottle Bar.
Yep, exactly.
Which is such a fantastic book, and it's sort of down that same sort of style of work. And again, they had to make a choice of what they're going to include and what they're not going to include. I would almost argue that someday on my to-do list, I would love to put together, the classic cocktails $100 bar, the tiki $100 bar, the modern cocktail. Well, I don't think it's possible to do tiki because I'm pretty sure you need 47 different rums to make anything.
That's why So seriously, Simple Cocktails, the website, I think I have one tiki drink on there because of that. Because of that, I mean, I try to limit the recipes to maybe 5 ingredients at the most, but usually 3 or 4. And so just about any tiki drink, it's exactly like you said. You need 3 types of rum, papaya juice, and just
Falernum, orgeat,
and
all
you
these
get there and
things
you're
that
like,
nobody
forget it.
has.
Yep. It's
Yeah.
like, just
And
forget
it's a
that.
shame. I think I will say, I mean, I think, when you talk about classic cocktails like a Manhattan or an old fashioned, it's once you've done it 3 or 4 times and you kind of have a sense for how to do it, you can make a fantastic cocktail at home. I would say tiki bars, I still will just go to a tiki bar rather than try to make them at home. And yeah, I could probably figure it out, but there's so many ingredients, and there are ingredients that don't keep forever, for example. And there's lots of different rums, and whether you make it with a Jamaican rum versus a Puerto Rican rum might completely change the flavor of a drink. So I just delegate that one to the tiki bartenders. They do such a good job.
Yeah, that's where I am. I mean, there's probably some tiki loving websites out there, and that's one of those things. Once I started building Simple Cocktails, I had to make decisions on what would get included and what wouldn't. And tiki is awesome, and I appreciate it very much. But tiki and simple almost never go together.
Yeah. And I think something that I'd love to learn more about, and maybe some folks out there listening can give us some advice in the comments, is really, what can you skip? What can what substitutions can you make? Can you just make it with one rum? I think for some cocktails you probably can, and for some you probably can't. And I don't have a good sense for that distinction. I think there truly is a lot of knowledge that goes into that area.
Yeah, for sure. And there's a handful of experts on tiki out there, and so generally I just default their way.
Nothing wrong with that. Plus, when you go to the tiki bars, they have the best glassware and the best garnishes. It just doesn't get better than that.
Yeah, the home bar shopping list has to get pretty long before you start adding tiki mugs and orgeat and all that kind of stuff.
I agree. I definitely agree. So to change topics just a little bit, you told me before we started recording that you actually just launched a book.
Yeah, sure did.
So tell me a little bit about it. Because I think it was just in July, right?
Yeah, so July 4th was release date. My first book. I would say I'm a trained journalist, so I have a degree in journalism. So I have kind of a deep passion for writing. And so when I started Simple Cocktails, I think one of those dreams was writing a book. That was kind of one of those. I didn't know how to achieve it, and I had some ideas for it. But this one came together well because the company that publishes it does a lot of history-centric books and regional history-centric books. And so they've done several. So I'm in Albuquerque, New Mexico, so they've done several, like Forgotten Albuquerque and certain cultures of Albuquerque. And so they do these very kind of targeted but regional books. And so they actually approached me and said, hey, we are looking for an author to write a book about cocktails in New Mexico, and we think that you're the guy. Do you have any interest in that? Can you get us a proposal? And so then I just dumped it on them. I was like, oh man, you have no idea. I've been waiting for this. And so I think that for nowadays, a really helpful thing to have, I didn't mean to turn this into book advice time, but a really helpful thing is if you take your own photos or have a good library of photos of whatever it is you do, that makes a huge difference. And so early on in the days of Simple Cocktails, I would get press releases with what we call bottle shots, which is like totally white background with a bottle of Jim Beam or whatever. And I just, from day one, I thought that looks just really boring and really stale. And so from day one, I was probably taking iPhone photos of my cocktails in my kitchen. And then from, maybe a few months in, I realized photos look better when they're well lit, and upgraded my camera a little bit. And so pretty much now, I'd say 99% of the photos on the site I take in my own backyard. And so it's nice to have that sort of resource. But having that built up, I had this library. I'd done 400 blog posts, most of them with photos of cocktails. And so when someone comes along and says, hey, we want you to write a cocktail book, we have room for some color photography, do you have any of that? Then it's an easier answer because I have it already just saved up, raring to go.
And you have the skill set. If you were to find, well, this chapter, I don't really have any photos that fit here, well, I'll go take some.
Yeah, that's exactly right. And for the book itself, it was a little bit that way with brandy. I didn't have a whole lot of brandy cocktails, so I had to ramp that up a little bit.
Which I'm sure twist my arm, right? Like,
Yeah,
I
exactly.
guess I just have to make some brandy cocktails.
So the book itself is called New Mexico Cocktails, and the publisher really wanted historical elements in it, but in some ways I sort of tricked them into just letting me write a really good cocktail book with some cool stories from New Mexico. And so it's just a good cocktail book. You can buy it in, if you want to skip chapter 1, which tells you about New Mexico and cocktails, you just start with the next chapter. And I have it broken up by spirit, which to me, as a beginner, a lot of my favorite cocktail books were broken up that way. That way I could turn to the gin chapter and say, okay, I have gin. What can I make in here? And a lot of those recipes in there are some of the recipes I wrote down early on at the beginning of Simple Cocktails because I wanted this book to be really easy to make. So I would say each chapter for each spirit probably has about 10 or 20 recipes. And so it doesn't have a zillion recipes. It probably has about 75 or 100.
So when I think of cocktails and cocktail history, I'll be honest with you, I don't typically think of New Mexico. Is there like a very, very brief synopsis of sort of the historical side of things without sort of spoiling the ending?
Yeah, that's a thank you for asking it that way because the ending is a pretty funny ending, but
oh, good to know. I'll have to check it out.
So the history of cocktails in New Mexico is basically beer and what was described. You would order it like this in the day. You would say whiskey straight, and that was like basically a whiskey straight was the cocktail of New Mexico. I mean, really, for a really, really long time. New Mexico is very stunted in its behavior with alcohol, unfortunately. And so that has affected our cocktail culture a little bit. We have very intense like drinking and driving laws and stuff like that basically people ignore. And so it's made it very difficult to open a bar because licensing is kind of crazy and especially to open like a really targeted craft bar, it's been pretty difficult for people. And so there's, today there's just a handful. There's actually probably more in Santa Fe than there are in Albuquerque because it's more of a tourist town. So there's more people who come to Santa Fe expecting great drinks, and they definitely find them there. But yeah, the history of cocktails in New Mexico is really more like a history of beer and whiskey.
Interesting. So do you think that's kind of self-fulfilling? Because, if a generation grows up drinking beer and whiskey straight, they may not be as open to a craft Manhattan or a gin swizzle or something like that. And then they don't go to your craft cocktail bar that just opened and the craft cocktail bar doesn't survive. Do you think there's some of that? Or is it just truly like a regulatory problem?
Yeah, no, I think you're totally nailing it. And I think everybody's doing all they can to deal with that now, the fans of craft cocktails. And my perspective in the book, from a New Mexico's perspective, but I actually think this applies anywhere, is to have kind of a great craft cocktail culture. I feel like you need three things. You need bartenders who really care about making craft cocktails. You need local producers. So in our case, that would be like distilleries. And then the third thing is you need enthusiasts who are kind of cheerleading the whole thing, which is where I put myself. I sort of put myself in that camp where I go to a great bar, I get a great drink, I talk about it, because that's how we're all going to get the word out.
Absolutely.
Yeah, so I think that applies everywhere. It's just here we've had to really team up. It's a very small community. I mean, we have 7 distilleries in the state of New Mexico right now.
Wow, that's it? That's really surprising.
And actually, once Prohibition ended, it was 70 years before the first distillery opened. Our very first legal distillery didn't open until 2005.
That is amazing. I had no idea. Let me guess, whiskey?
Funny enough, our first legal distillery started as a winery, and then they started doing stuff with the wine. So it remains.
That makes sense.
Yeah, it's called Don Quixote Distillery, and they distill more products than anybody else in the state because I think they just have fun doing it. So they have multiple brandies, they have a couple of gins, they have a couple of vodkas, they do have whiskey they make with New Mexico blue corn. So they have just a giant library, and they have like a cherry eau de vie. I mean, they just go for it.
Good for them.
Yeah, it's very cool.
That's great. That's really good to see. I think, like you said, it is sort of a three-legged stool. You can have bartenders and local producers, but if nobody's ordering the drinks and swiping their credit cards, then unfortunately it's just not going to last. And so I think anybody out there who's listening from New Mexico, do you have any suggestions on some New Mexico cocktails they can order to really spur the movement?
I think even just ordering classic cocktails is a thing that I'm seeing more of, and that I would encourage people to do more of. I mean, going to a bar and ordering a Manhattan is, in New Mexico is very unique. I mean, if you're not ordering a Bud Light, what are you doing drinking in the state? That's the most common thing that a bartender is going to pour is a Bud Light in New Mexico. And so to go and order a Manhattan or an old fashioned, and then if you get a great one, to keep going back and to support that bartender in that bar, I think that's the way to go, is just and then to tell all your friends, this is the place to go. You want to get a great Manhattan, go here. I mean, I try to do that. I have a bit of a following or a forum or something in that, friends text message me relatively often and say, okay, I'm at X bar, what should I get? Or, hey, I'm about to go out to a bar, which one should I go to? I still have to figure out a way of setting up some sort of payment system where they text me their bar related questions and I charge them like $20 to give them.
There's got to be a way to do that. There's got to be. I'll be right there. We'll do one for San Francisco. We'll sign up with you. Maybe there's an app for that. So, I mean, the book sounds amazing. I'm not personally from New Mexico, but I have visited Albuquerque a couple times. We have not made it to Santa Fe yet. But the next time we're around, we're definitely going to have to text you for some cocktail suggestions.
Yeah, for sure.
And we'll pay you if you want.
Yeah, good. Just buy me a drink. That'd be enough.
You're on. We'll have to meet you somewhere. Well, now that you did mention that we're both husband and wife podcasters. I mean, there's got to be a double date in our future. There's just has to be.
Yeah, I think so. And I didn't mention this. I've been keeping it secret. But you have to do this. Go into iTunes and look at Mixology Talk, and then go over and look at Simple Cocktails, and look at the date that we both started podcasting. It's almost the same day. It's within a week of each other. Yeah.
Oh, how funny. Because you mentioned you've been doing it for 2 years, and I just looked at the calendar and went, we've been doing it for about 2 years.
Yeah. So if you go and look,
crazy.
It's like these two people who had no idea about each other had a great idea at exactly the same time and kind of jumped into the game at the same time. So that's kind of
so
a funny thing to notice too.
I'll definitely have to check that out. Yeah, I want to say that we launched in iTunes in early July 2014. I don't remember the exact date though. I'll have to check it out for sure.
I want to say it was the same for us. I know it was July. And it's like I said, I think it's within a week of each other. So
what are the chances? There are not a lot of spirits podcasts out there, or cocktail podcasts, I should say.
There was clearly a need for it, and both of us recognized it. So good for us.
Yeah. Well, and here we are. Yeah, yep. Indeed. So you mentioned the New Mexico Cocktails book is your first book, and you also, I happen to know, a little birdie told me that you did a seminar, a talk at San Antonio Cocktail Week on cigar cocktail pairings. Is that a topic that there may be a book in your future? Or
oh wow, that's a psychic ability right there. Yeah, that's definitely something I like to do. There's a lot.
What a great topic!
I know. Well, there's a lot of books about cocktails, and there's a lot of books about cigars, and there's a lot of books about cigar pairing, but it doesn't tend to be cocktail based. It's about having cigars and scotch, or having cigars and brandy, or having cigars and cognac, but there isn't a lot of discussion about cocktails. And the big thing I've discovered, because I'm a pretty active cigar smoker in Albuquerque, it's quite warm in the summer and pretty cold in the winter. So I'll smoke all summer long and then not at all in the winter. And so I've had this kind of experience being the cocktail guy of what goes well with a cigar and what doesn't. And a big part of my lecture in San Antonio was people typically pair cigars with drinks that taste like cigars. And I actually don't think that's the best idea. So they smoke a cigar and they drink a scotch, which is generally smoky and kind of spicy, or they'll have a bourbon or something like that. And my thought, and what I was kind of challenging the crowd there to do, is to actually go the opposite route. If you have smoky cigar, or you have kind of a dry herbal cigar, maybe you make a sweeter drink. I told him, have you guys ever had a White Russian with a cigar? It's a pretty awesome fit.
You know what? I never would have just thought of that, but I can absolutely see it working. You could see that creaminess kind of like cooling it down a little bit, giving you that nice contrast.
And pretty early on, I started to prefer sweeter things with cigars. I don't generally like sweet drinks or, sweetness, but when I'm drinking straight stuff, usually I'm going with like a rum, like an aged rum or something like that. It has a little spice, but it's naturally sweeter than maybe a rye or a scotch. And so, yeah, I'll lean in that direction. I'll have something like a Negroni. And then what you discover is some of the stuff some drinks that you love, if you pair them with a cigar, you end up in this very weird situation where it doesn't taste great. So for me, I really like really juniper forward gins. So I really like Tanqueray, like old school London dry juniper forward gins. And there was once I made a martini with it, sat down with the cigar, and I was like, this doesn't go together at all. I mean, it's such a bad fit because it's so herbal and so earthy, and it's got all these herbs and stuff like that. And it was just a really bad pairing with the cigar that I had. And so there's stuff like that you discover. And so I think that would make a pretty good forum.
Yeah, absolutely.
In a book form.
But even going the other direction, I mean, I'll be the first to tell you, I don't know anything about cigars. But, my next question would be, what would go with, a London dry martini? Anything at all? Or, I mean, just curious.
It would almost need to be something. That's a great question. So a lot.
I'm putting you on the spot. Sorry.
I know that's a really tough one. So the other thing is it's very palate based. So when I did the thing in San Antonio, when you do seminars, they'll make 2 cocktails for the people who go to the seminars. And so what I did is I made a Tanqueray martini, and then I made a Manhattan, like a rye Manhattan. And the point I was trying to prove to the people who were there, and we actually. So this was San Antonio in January, and it was quite warm. It was like 75. And we met on the rooftop of the hotel. And so we actually got to smoke cigars during the seminar, which was the best way it could have possibly
That sounds like a
out.
Terrible seminar.
Yeah,
it was hanging
awesome.
out on the rooftop with a cigar and a cocktail.
It was awesome. So I made these 2 drinks, and the idea, my secret plan was like, I'm going to make one that doesn't taste good and make one that tastes good. But there was a couple of guys that were like, this is great. They were loving the martini with the cigar. And so it's kind of palate related. I mean, off the top of my head, there are certain regions. Cigars are a lot like wine. There's regions that are known for a specific flavor profile. And so some of the more earthy herbal regions like Honduras would probably be not a great fit with the martini because that would also be kind of earthy and herbal. I would almost want to go with something that's very, very sweet and maybe, oh man, you got me stumped. I would almost say like I'd rather just have a vodka martini with a cigar than I would a gin, and I know that's.
And there's nothing wrong with that too. I mean, sometimes there just isn't a good pairing for something, and that's okay. I mean, that cocktail belongs with something that's not a cigar.
Yeah, exactly.
And I did give you a tough one.
Yeah, I know. I have to go study up.
It's true. You're totally slacking here. No, I'm kidding.
I have to make a bunch of martinis and get a bunch of cigars, and
I think we need some research and development. Yeah, definitely. I love it. Now that's really interesting. Because like I said, I don't know anything at all about cigars, but the concept of pairing is really challenging across the board. We often get questions about food pairing with cocktails. And I think there's definitely some sort of core concepts that you can steal from the wine world around full-bodied goes with this and crisp and tart goes with that and that sort of thing. But it is really challenging, I think. And it's especially challenging because, depending on how you make your cocktail, it might taste quite different. I personally like my margaritas quite a bit sweeter than Chris does. So the margarita that I make might go with a completely different food than with the one that Chris makes. And so it's hard to make those generalizations without knowing how the bar is going to actually make the cocktail.
That's totally true. And the really, really tricky thing about cigars is you're basically putting something that's on fire in your mouth for an extended period of time, which means an hour later, your tongue is kind of shot. You really can't taste what you could taste an hour before. And so that's the other kind of problem you start running into. And that's usually why people pair really strong whiskey, really spicy stuff with their cigars, is because if you work down too far, you just don't taste anything after long.
Yeah, you're probably not going to be doing like an aviation or something with a very, very light floral flavor. It's just going to be completely missed.
Totally gone. Yep.
Yeah, yeah. Well, that's really interesting. So if you do end up writing that book, definitely let me know. That's a fantastic topic. Really, really interesting. So I definitely want to wrap this up in the interest of time, but I have to ask, what's next? Like, as you look forward with Simple Cocktails, I mean, I have a sneaky suspicion the podcast is here to stay, just because it's a great podcast with a great following. But what's coming up?
Yeah, I think you've got it. I think the podcast we initially did as kind of a companion to the blog, and these days I almost see the podcast is as affording us an opportunity to do stuff that I can't do on the blog. The other thing about the podcast is I get to do it with my wife, which she doesn't really write on the blog. She helps with some of my photos and stuff. She makes sure the blog looks good, but she doesn't do a lot of the writing. And when we do stuff like go to Tales of the Cocktail, then her and I get to interview people and get to kind of strategize on what interviews we even put in the podcast and stuff like that. And she's a fun gal to work with. And so, yeah, the podcast will continue to be really important to us and be something that I think the hope is that will be something that allows us to even travel more and be able to go to distilleries or go to places where great cocktails are being made and be able to talk to the people who are doing them. And so I think there's more of that in our future.
Awesome. It sounds fantastic. I think there's so much, something that really surprised me when we started our podcast is just that there is no shortage of things to talk about, of things to learn, of people to talk to. This is actually, we haven't done an interview in probably more than a year. It's been quite a while, but we're going to be starting to do a little bit more interviews in the coming months, and it's just such a great excuse to meet interesting people. So it's a little bit selfish, I suppose, but I'm sure you found the same.
Yeah, it's definitely, I mean, at Tales this year, we got to interview like Jeffrey Morgenthaler. We got to, Steven Soderbergh was launching his Spirit. And so we got to meet the kind of like big names, some of them bartenders I look up to or have looked up to. You know, I was watching Morgenthaler's videos when I started my blog. And so to run into guys like that, it's like you said, I just want to meet this guy. I guess we can talk to him for the podcast, but I really want to meet this guy. So it gives you an excuse to sit there with a hero for half an hour. You know what I mean?
It's so true. It's so true. Well, I'll definitely include a couple of links to your Tales of the Cocktail series. It was an episode for each day, if I remember correctly.
Yeah, so we record daily episodes. I have a little handheld recorder, and we get
there on
Wednesday.
That's a lot of work.
Oh my gosh, it's so
tiring. I am
tiring.
Impressed. Not to mention, Tales in and of itself is a lot of work. Just keeping up, drinking enough water.
Yeah, no kidding. But it's really fun. It's fun to fit that in. For us, I see it as, you know, before we went to Tales, which was first time was last year. Before we went, I would always see kind of Twitter and Instagram, everything light up with people at Tales. And you know, you sort of get to experience Tales through their lens. And so I thought that the podcast would be a similar experience for people. As busy as Tales is, I don't imagine a lot of people at Tales listening to our podcast every day. But I do imagine everybody else outside now has this window. Okay, here's what happened today, you know, and so I feel like in some ways it's almost like a service. Like we get to go have this awesome experience, and so we'll just kind of throw up a movie screen and show you what we're experiencing during it.
Which is wonderful, because there's so many folks out there who can't find their way to New Orleans every July, ourselves included. We didn't make it this year. I had some serious FOMO going on watching the social media this year, though, seeing all of the amazing parties. I was tempted to like block it, and I was like, I'm just going to block it. I can't do it anymore. Hide the hashtag. Right. It's so true. But I think it's really neat also to be able to share that experience, share what you're learning. You know, like you said, share the conversations you're having with interesting people, and then the folks who can't quite get their shifts covered or swing the airfare and all of the costs involved because it's so expensive, we can shine a light and share that with them. So maybe we'll be right there with you next July. I hope so.
Good. That sounds great.
We'll have to do there you go. We'll do a double date podcast next July if it works out. Awesome. Well, thank you so much again for joining us. I'll definitely include a bunch of those links in the show notes. I believe this is going to be episode number 81. So that'll be mixologytalk.com/81. And yeah, thank you so much. I really appreciate you coming on.
Great talking to you, Julia, and you guys have fun.
Cheers. So as promised, I did go ahead and stock their podcast on iTunes, and I found out they beat us by about 2 weeks. The Simple Cocktails podcast came out on the 18th of June, 2014, and our first episode came out on the 11th of July. So well done, Greg. You guys definitely beat us by a couple of weeks, but either way, it's definitely great to be alongside you in iTunes. Thanks for taking a little bit of time out of your day, Greg. It was really, really great chatting with you, and I hope folks listening will definitely check out his podcast and check out a bunch of the links. I put all of those links that we talked about in the show notes over at mixologytalk.com/81. So what do you think of this episode? Do you like the interview style? I'm looking forward to doing more of this style of podcast episode coming in the future, so definitely let me know your feedback. Let me know what you think. You can drop those in the comments at mixologytalk.com/81. Thanks again, everyone. Cheers. Never miss an episode by subscribing in iTunes or YouTube. And as always, check out the show notes by clicking on the right.